Hello, and welcome to this Bournebrook podcast. This week, columnist Guy Denton talks to the author and columnist Amity Shlaes. Guy begins by asking Amity about her political background.
Thank you. I always like to begin by asking my guests about their backgrounds. How exactly did your political views develop, and how did you come to pursue a career in political commentary and historical writing?
My political views aren't political, they're pragmatic, and they come out of economics and the experience of economics and how people really behave on the ground in the world, and then what principles are they operating under, and what sort of natural laws can we derive from observing that. I spent quite a bit of time on the edge of communism in Germany before the Berlin Wall came down. So I got to look at the economies, the planned economies of East Europe, and observe how poorly they functioned. And then I began to see what functioned well in the West, and that tended to be freer markets.
That's very interesting. Well, in terms of applying economics to history, American history more broadly is currently under assault very much by certain groups which seek to demonize figures ranging from the founders to Lincoln while undermining the American creed. What do you think is the responsibility of the historian in such a moment? And how concerned are you about these challenges to American history?
Well, history, again, is telling the story of what happened. And the question is, are we accurately depicting what happened? The data are there. So you can look at various governments, look at their policies, and then see what was the unemployment rate, or what was the subsequent unemployment rate, what happened to inflation in the country, or government debt. Historians sometimes overlook the data, I think partly because they were educated in history and are a little bit afraid of data. So what they'll do is they'll pick a guru in econ and say, that's my guru, I'll do what he says because she knows better than I what happens in econ, and go from there. But that's unwise. Actually, economics is not that hard. It has a big mystification factor. It's run more or less by a guild, which has a kind of Wizard of Oz power. Only I understand, and only you do not. But that's ridiculous. It's a lot of it's common sense, and anyone of fair sense of curiosity can discern the reality. So I think historians are too timid in regard to what certain economists tell them, and then certain economic theories lend themselves to politics. Keynesianism is window dressing for interest group spending. Basically, you say, oh, it's good for the economy, I'll undertake a stimulus, and that will help old ladies. Well, the old ladies will vote for you then. It's just like that. And that equation, most people understand, right? So therefore, Keynesian economics with spending must be good economics. And the results, the outcomes are more diffuse. You don't have a whole class of people. Sometimes you'll just have overall negative outcome from a stimulus. And so the voters aren't even necessarily aware what their current disadvantage comes from, and therefore they don't draw the political consequences. So that's kind of the cycle. But if you go back and actually look at what happened with data, you can see pretty clearly why, and it's the obligation of the historian to depict that.
I think that the issue of data also raises a broader, equally interesting question about other historical distortions. Obviously, it's never been easier to ascertain historical facts and to access various statistics and so on via the internet. And yet certain distortions of American history continue to endure, many very obvious ones, such as the Charles Beard idea that the founders were all property owners who executed the founding purely to enrich themselves, and so on. These sorts of notions are repeated by many, despite having been thoroughly debunked. And why do you think that this is the case? Why do these sorts of falsehoods continue to endure? And how can historians best diminish them in the minds of Americans?
Oh, with close empirical work. I'm not, Charles Beard was part of the first wave of progressive historians. And he was interesting, but as you say, I don't agree with his conclusions necessarily, and nor do they seem to correlate to the evidence I see. Again, it's just sort of an unwillingness to look at the numbers, and also to look at sometimes people accuse me of being too numbers oriented. To look at the human soul. Man or woman has a soul. And the human soul is, that autonomy and maybe that religious faith, that's part of history too, and that tends to get neglected in history as well. That the motivations of the soul for action.
On a slightly lighter note, perhaps, what do you think distinguishes engaging historical writing from dry historical writing? Your books have always been very enjoyable to read, and I'm curious if you can speak to any common traps that budding authors may tend to fall into.
Well, nothing is ever perfect. As a UK historian once said, I'm trying to think who it was, maybe it was an American historian, said history is like that, very chancy. Things happen. Things happen you didn't expect to happen. I think it was Samuel Eliot Morison, actually. So anyway, things happen. So rather than work on one's own theory to one's own satisfaction, what one should do is ask the people in the period what happened. And so I tend to write about the people. And let them tell the story and give their analysis. Of course, it's more imprecise. So, and of course, the outcome isn't always what one expects, but that's all right. We're looking for history, not philosophy. People have to develop their own philosophy. So there it is. On balance, in my analysis of data I have surveyed, markets do better than planning on balance, but there's a lot more to it, maybe things I or other historians don't understand. So tell the story through the people, and the people may well know something that the author does not know. So an author should give himself up to his subjects, not the other way around.
Well, to that point, my favorite of your books is your biography of Coolidge, who is still dismissed by certain scholars as a rather colorless figure, perhaps even an inconsequential or even harmful figure in terms of the policies that he pursued. What attracted you to Coolidge in the first place? And what are some common misconceptions about his presidency that tend to irritate you?
Well, at the Coolidge Foundation, where I work, our main job is to convey Coolidge, what he said and did not, to tell people how to rank him. And when one surveys what he did, one approves of it very often, but that's of course up to the individual. Coolidge is misunderstood. I think the analogy is sports. If you like one player, you don't like another player. It's sort of a zero-sum rank system in sports. There's there's the top hitter and the bottom hitter, and you rank them. And two people can't be top hitter. If you're ranking athletes. Well, people do the same with political leaders. They'll rank the presidents, and if one is high, ergo another must be low. That doesn't really work, because each president has something to offer the polity. Something interesting about him. There's no need to rank them. It's just human nature that wants to rank. So Coolidge, because he was the opposite of Franklin Roosevelt, and also to some extent the opposite of someone from his own party, that would be Theodore Roosevelt, ranks low if Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt are rated high. You start by wanting to rank Franklin Roosevelt high. Therefore, because Coolidge had very different principles, you rank him low. That's not very productive for knowledge, but that is the impetus. It kind of works backward. I'm thinking of the standard person's logic. It goes like this. Franklin Roosevelt was a great president. He won World War II for the United States. He was a Navy president. He was awesome. He led us in the good war. Therefore, he was great. Clearly, things weren't perfect in the Great Depression, the 10 years before when unemployment was over 10%, but he tried and he got us through his first-class temperament, his heroism, his inspiration that he gave us. That's sort of what people, that's how they explained it to their children. And then they would whisper kind of in a lower way. I'm thinking of my mother, who was a convinced Democrat and very thoughtful. She said, of course you know, but always in a very low voice, of course you know, we didn't get out of the Depression in the United States until the war. So that was an argument for spending, because of course US did increase spending mightily in World War II. But it wasn't the New Deal that got us out of the war. It was the spending of World War II. So that is received wisdom, and therefore Coolidge, who was in the 20s, who didn't spend, must be bad. And because he was, but it starts with an affection for Roosevelt, and the rest is sort of reductio ad absurdum,
Well, as an extension of that point, I suppose, what are some of the most salient economic lessons that can be learned from Coolidge's governance, especially given the current economic situation around the world?
Well, say two things about Coolidge. So this is the president who served in the 20s. He was a more presider than a potentate. He didn't like potentates. He didn't believe in individual power or greatness. And he had the sanctimony. His name wasn't Calvin by accident. Calvin Coolidge, he wasn't named after Calvin and Hobbes. He was named after John Calvin. So he had that sanctimony of a Protestant, and he really believed he should scrub himself of vanity at every point, and he actually hurt himself. So we don't know about him because he didn't want us to know about him, because to make monuments to oneself reflects vanity, and he didn't want to be vain. But there's also a vanity in sanctimony. People cut off their nose to spite their face. And all this, so that's one reason we don't know about Coolidge, but the actual empirical evidence is the following. Coolidge believed that the progressives in the world were embarking on a dangerous experiment that would slow progress and impede the improvements in the standard of living and in the quality of life all around. He didn't really like progressive steps on the federal level, on the national level very much. He felt they overdid it. So we had a progressive wave in the United States when he became president, and in fact he was vice president first to Warren Harding, and Harding passed away. The pair of them believed in what they called normalcy, which is a horrible word, but what it really meant was common sense, and they wanted to be sure there was enough room for business to help the economy pull forward, and for business not to be the enemy. They wanted lighter taxation. They worked incrementally, by the way. These were not revolutionaries, right? So we want to pull back taxation. We want to be sure the business environment is not too bad. We want people to look to themselves or to enterprise for improvement, not to Washington. And we'll write such policies so the tax rate coming out of World War I, the income tax was very high, even though it was a young tax, over 50%. And gradually Harding, Wilson in fact, but Harding and Coolidge especially pulled the income tax down so that the top marginal rate on the income tax, which is key, became at the end 25% for Coolidge, which is a considerable drop. They also established a low capital gains rate, which is important for commerce and rational movements in the market that are helpful for productivity. So that's the most important thing. In addition, Coolidge cut spending. And what's remarkable about him, we believe now that a president cannot cut spending in peacetime. maybe after a war, but only then. They can, at the very least, a president or a political leader of a Western nation can do is reduce the increase in spending. Coolidge actually cut spending even as the population grew. So the size of the federal government went down not only per capita, but absolutely. Really interesting. And so he's kind of, he achieved by restraint and cutting, very unusual format for a leader, very unusual style, very likable because it's so distinct from the others. That's what he did. And today, we barely believe such a thing is possible. So we kind of look past him. He's kind of, in American history books, Coolidge is kind of a place warmer for the presidency between progressives, between Roosevelts.
You raised a very interesting point there about Coolidge's view of incremental change, reform only when it was necessary. It evoked to me the wonderful speech he gave on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence regarding American exceptionalism and honoring the intentions of the founders and so on. What did Coolidge make of the progressive arguments and ideas that were gaining favor around the time that he was in office about experts running everything and the Wilsonian notion that the Constitution was antiquated and so on?
Well, he liked the Constitution. We're just about to publish the autobiography again, and I'm writing about that. And he believed there was plenty of wisdom in it the way it was, and didn't see a need to change. So it's very un-European. You know, in the whole struggle of the UK and Europe, or, you know, Constitution and judges as architects, that whole thing, that was not very Coolidge. He was on the other side. He thought there was to have a basic document with not too much detail was useful. Principles, not 100 lines of regulation, not, you know, for every little question. The writer Philip Howard is very interesting on this, by the way, when you think of regulation now, and the overwriting of law. So that's actually very much a common law tradition. You can see it in Australia and New Zealand too sometimes. So anyway, that's who Coolidge was, and that's very important. I'm forgetting the rest of the question.
I think that about covers it. So
I'm forgetting, but so you think of someone who says the law is fine as it was. And principles, not potentates. There's some interesting footage of Coolidge at Rushmore, where we had the big busts of the presidents, these mega busts in the granite. And Coolidge was very ambivalent about Rushmore, though he was involved in an appropriation for it. Very ambivalent about busts that large. And the sculptor, who was no dummy, Gutzon Borglum, figured out that Coolidge really didn't like the idea of being told there might be a Coolidge bust. So he hired Coolidge to write some text. That's more Coolidge. The word, right? The word. And Coolidge was supposed to write some text, but the pair fell out over what the text that was to be carved in the mountain would say. Very Coolidge too. Coolidge didn't mess lightly with constitutional principles, and they broke up, and the principles were not indicted. That was the verb they used, written into the stone. Isn't that funny? So that was Coolidge. Words, not images. Really American Protestant, very Old Testament too.
Coolidge was also famously cordial, though taciturn. And do you think that contemporary, not only presidents, but all contemporary political figures perhaps, would be well served by resisting the allure of performance and simply staying silent, or exercising greater tact in their public speech, perhaps?
Well, yes. Yes, I'll just stop there as if I were Coolidge. Yes. We've obscured deeds with words. We've trained ourselves to listen to words, not deeds. And think about when you're hiring, you listen to someone and you like his words, that's the first impression, or her words. But then you say, will this person do the work? We don't have that sense of judgment anymore in picking political leaders. That doesn't mean we can't recapture it. So Coolidge was all about deeds, not words. Very kind to say that he was funny. He was actually one of the funniest presidents because he uses pauses very well. There was a humorist at the time named Will Rogers, who I never heard of when I was growing up, but was world famous at the time. And Will Rogers appreciated Coolidge's use of timing in telling a joke, the pauses, the agricultural humor. American farmers have a certain kind of humor which is very understated. And I'm not going to attempt to have to try out Coolidge's accent, but it was said that Coolidge pronounced the word cow with 3 syllables. Cow, you know, and that he certainly knew how to use a pause. When you speak less, you agree to less. He knew that as a politician. He was not stupid, so he was very conscious of his own of the use of brevity. One spoke of adequate brevity vis-a-vis Coolidge. And think about it this way: he trained as a lawyer. He was by temperament more solicitor than barrister. He understood that people didn't like paying by the hour. The talkier the lawyer, the more you have to pay him, right? And he was famously brief as a young attorney trying to win clients. He was fearfully afraid that he would get no clients. So he thought of ways to save clients money. And one way was to bill fewer hours, and therefore one spoke less. And then in politics, the same. He tended to over-deliver and under-promise, which is something one falls in love with as a voter or client. If I wanted to argue that Coolidge were relevant now, I would say Coolidge was a creature of the pre-17th Amendment America. In his early days, the senators of the United States were picked by the state senates, not by the electorate. So voters wouldn't vote in a senator. They would vote in a congressman, but not a senator. The senators were more of an elite, in a good way, picked by men who knew them, mostly men, and sent to Washington. And that meant that the senators didn't pick the chattiest person. They picked the person they liked best and could rely on most. But you can't rely on someone whose acquaintance you haven't made, right? So that was when the country was more of a republic than it is now, and less of a democracy in that American tension. And Coolidge was a creature of that, even though he did support the 17th Amendment. Later, he appears to have been ambivalent about that support. He was a state progressive. He believed states undertook progressive measures, and, well, the state maybe fed babies, funded schools, and so on. And he voted for many of such measures as a state leader. He was a leader in the Bay State, the state of Massachusetts, which is a mightily progressive state, in the van of progressive states. By the time he got to Washington, he was less progressive, partly because he believed that Washington need not be progressive. That was the work of the states. At the time in the United States, the states were a bigger presence in the economy with the towns than the federal government. And in part, I think, because he saw the results of state progressivism and became less of a progressive. So those were the two reasons. The later Coolidge was not progressive. The early Coolidge was if you look at what he voted for, could be ranked as a progressive.
Is there perhaps a particularly obscure but nonetheless whimsical or amusing fact about Coolidge that you could share?
Oh, there are many. He loved animals. He said that anyone who really didn't have animals in the White House didn't really deserve to be president either. But he did use his animals for politics. For example, he received a pair twin lion cubs from the mayor of Johannesburg, and he named them after his principles, Tax Reduction and Budget Bureau. He didn't name them socks, or whatever else leaders usually give sweet names to their animals. That was to his point that you couldn't cut taxes without keeping an eye to the budget and commensurately cutting the budget. He was not a modern supply sider where he believed tax cuts would do all the work. And that very amusing. He always was suspicious of people who cut taxes and didn't care about the budget. Oh gosh, that really, because what happens, and he was also suspicious that what if you cut taxes and you got more money, because you sometimes do get more money, the federal government, when you cut a rate, just because business likes the lighter taxation and it's more active, fueling more revenues. Well, then the government would have more money and it would spend more and get accustomed to spending more. And he dreaded that. So you want to imagine a man profoundly uncomfortable in the president's seat. He really didn't like the power that came with the presidency. It was against his nature. It made him nervous to have an office so powerful. He was once walking along with a senator, maybe moping, maybe I think it was after the death of his son when he was president, and the senator was trying to cheer him up. And the senator, they walked past the White House, and the senator said, well, what lucky fellow gets to live in that White House with those nice pillars? And Coolidge replied, nobody, they just come and go. No one really ever makes the White House home because presidents are servants, not kings. Very funny, very to the point, very foreign to us now. Trying to think what else. He had plenty of agricultural humor. Because he came from a farm town, he came from a very poor farm place. That was Vermont. It was later, of course, some agricultural service later went through the town of Coolidge, which is called Plymouth Notch, and surveyed it and found that scarcely an acre of that of Plymouth was arable. It said in Vermont they farm rocks. It's a heartbreak farm. What you have in Vermont, it's not good land, which is why Americans left places like Vermont, rocky New England, and went west, where if you irrigated a bit, you had enormously fruitful land. So there he was from a place like that, and steeped in agriculture, and his humor was agricultural. He also saw Americans liked agricultural humor. So you often hear metaphors from him relating to animals, how the rooster can't fly too high. It goes on like that.
I'm sure that we could gleefully spend our entire conversation discussing Coolidge, but I do think it is only fair to also address your new book on President Johnson and the Great Society. Could you elaborate on why you chose this moment to write the book and what relevance it may hold to contemporary American affairs?
Well, I wrote a book called Forgotten Men about the 1930s. And in the 1930s, long story short, the government made matters worse in the United States. That's why we had so much unemployment for so long. And as we discussed before, Roosevelt was very popular, and the hopeful attitude of the policy in the 30s called the New Deal stayed with people, and they thought that was wonderful, and the idealism of the New Deal was wonderful. Idealism is always inspiring. So when did we continue the New Deal? That was in the 60s with Great Society. You'll notice it wasn't called Good Society, it was called Great Society. Very aspirational idea, born of some of World War II confidence. One of the commentators, Norman Podart, said that one of the goals of the Great Society was the abolition of poverty. We didn't say incrementally reduce poverty, which was already happening. We said abolish poverty or cure. That's the word of President Johnson, C-U-R-E, cure poverty. We said we would do that, Great Society. And Podart said, well, that? Well, that's just a mopping up action in the United States, a small effort relative to the great effort of winning World War II. Certainly we can do this. It turned out we couldn't. Great Society didn't work, but it was a continuation of the New Deal. So this was really a sequel to the 1930s book I wrote and to the 1930s examination of the effects of government policy. Another a good writer, Joe Califano, who is also an actor in the Great Society, once said, "We live in Lyndon Johnson's America." That is, the institutions put up by the Great Society and President Johnson, and I will add Nixon and Kennedy. We live among those institutions now. We live Medicare, our health program, Medicaid, our public radio, and our public television, and so on, were Great Society ventures. And then there are some New Deal ventures as well, institutions that we live among. But we live in Lyndon Johnson's America. And I thought that was worth examination. Similar to now, I mean, I wrote this book a few years ago, but similar to now, there was a new impetus in civil rights as well. We passed some laws, successive laws relating to civil rights. At the beginning of the 60s, African Americans in Mississippi did not vote. Well, why weren't they allowed to register to vote? Presuming they wanted to vote, I'm sure they did. What was that about that state that so few could vote? That, you know, we had good laws, I would judge, such as the Civil Rights Act of the 60s, that made it more likely they would be able to vote. That's part of the Great Society too. But generally in the Great Society, you want to separate, one could say, negative and positive rights. You want to separate the laws that just made it possible for people to live with dignity as humans and prosper, and those laws that gave things to people, that created the modern entitlement. And my research suggested to me that the entitlement laws were problematic and have placed burdens upon future generations today, and changed expectations, changed our polity, changed American culture in a counterproductive way.
Forgive the rather broad nature of this question, but if you could elaborate on that last point, what are some of the specific ways in which the Great Society programs backfired? And what are some of the alternatives that you believe the Johnson administration and the Kennedy administration should have pursued?
Well, I mean, there was a project by a civil rights activist named Robert Paris Moses. And Robert Paris Moses was down there, he being put in jail, fighting the bigoted sheriffs of the South and all that. But he was originally a math teacher. And he really came to the view that he was unhappy with the civil rights movement. He was unhappy with the Democratic Party. I have a chapter in Great Society about the terrible creepiness of the Democratic Party at the 1964 convention, where certain Mississippi delegates were not seated. Anyway, he got angry, and he developed eventually, many years later, but still, his conclusion, something called the Algebra Project. And he said, look, if African Americans can do algebra and hopefully trigonometry, and they can get jobs and their lives can get better. Well, this little project is little. It won a MacArthur Genius Grant. It's a great idea, but it never scaled because we spent a lot of money on other things, which is sort of social benefits and so on. So imagine if we had spent hundreds of millions on ensuring that African Americans and other poor Americans and disadvantaged Americans can do algebra. We would be a different country. And I have every confidence that African Americans, all of them, can do trigonometry. I mean, but we haven't emphasized that. We haven't emphasized, you know, ability to write business letters. We haven't emphasized ability, you know, any of that. We've emphasized helping people who are poor, which is good. But we want to be able to help people who are poor no longer to be poor, and gain in the workforce and have the tools to adjust when technology changes. If you can do algebra, and you can do some mechanics, then you can learn a new trade if your trade changes. if the but if you cannot, you're really hampered. And so I think we should have spent hundreds of millions on algebra and had and really been quite honest about the testing. Instead, we had, as President Bush put it, the soft bigotry of low expectations. And now we have a sort of politically correct culture that says one can't expect that because that's old school. Well, old school is pretty good school, especially also for newcomers. That's been the history of the United States.
Well, speaking to our current culture, programs similar to those embraced by President Johnson have never been more popular among Americans. And with that in mind, what do you believe has been the legacy of the Great Society, and how do you hope that your book will influence the American people's perception of that legacy?
Well, the motto of the book is nothing is new, it's just forgotten. What happened was all Americans saw the limits of the Great Society and its failures, particularly Bill Clinton. So look what happened under President Clinton. He changed and reduced welfare and focused it more towards work again. And he joined Republicans in doing that. He cut the capital gains tax, which is a capitalist tax that only rich people pay, at least according to critics. Wow, a Democrat who cut the capital gains tax. And the economy did very well and unemployment reduced, right? It dropped. And we became more prosperous generally. So that whole learning curve, an awful learning curve. The 70s were the result of the Great Society. They were a depressing purgatorial decade when opportunity did not look as great, and people, the 70s were, I know how the 70s were in other nations too, and they weren't so pretty there either, but the 70s were a decade in the United States where the house you bought had 2 fewer bedrooms because the interest rate was so high, or you didn't have enough money to buy a house because the interest rate was so high, or an employer didn't have enough money to hire you because the interest rate was so high. And things got better in the late 80s and 90s because we overcame the Great Society and realized it didn't work. We became so prosperous, we're a kind of a casualty of our own success, that we forgot the outcome of the Great Society, but remembered the idealism of it. And like that, the general assumption now is we can afford anything in the United States. So anything that's imperfect must be righted by the federal government because we can afford to fix it. The economy will always be there to fund whatever we undertake. Very 60s attitude, very lovable attitude, but hope is not a policy. Hope should lead to logical policy. So you have a whole generation of people poorly educated, in part because of Great Society structuring of education. One of the factors in the United States is very important and rarely discussed, and I delved into quite a bit in Great Society, was the Great Society supported trade unions and public sector unions very strongly. Public sector unions, if you're in a public sector union and you're a teacher, you tend to like government and be part of government. And so teachers tend to like government, so they tend to like books that like government. So the negative consequences of the Great Society or the New Deal are forgotten by teachers because they're employed to work, they're part of the government. And their union is part of the government. The union somehow compounded that. So there you are. I mean, you see that in the debate right now about whether teachers should go back to work, notwithstanding the health challenges of COVID and the real dangers. They don't view themselves as public servants so much as union members sometimes. I actually like teachers and I don't like to trash them, but one has to concede that our public sector unions somehow slow things up generally in the United States and certainly burden taxpayers with heavy demands. The problem in Chicago right now is not just that Michigan Avenue, a beautiful avenue, is being destroyed by looting. It's not just COVID. It's not just the troubles of the poor. It's that Illinois is about to run out of money due to its pension commitments in the public sector, some of them wrested from the government by very powerful unions, made powerful by 1960s changes in law and policy.
We've previously referenced your work on the New Deal, and I am curious, what lessons do you believe could be learned from the impact of the New Deal and the government's response to the Great Depression at a time of severe economic crisis as we are currently enduring?
Certain data points resemble Great Depression data points. But what made the Great Depression great was not one 25% unemployment number, which we had. It was that the unemployment endured 10 years. That's what made it great. That's what made the 20s troubling in the United Kingdom and the 30s as well, right? It was the duration of the unemployment. So the lesson from the New Deal is that you have to make a situation in which employers feel like they might rehire again. We did not do that through our policy. Example was we put upward pressure on wages through exhortation by leaders, but also through specific laws. So the wages that the law said employers had to pay were rather high, and that's perverse in a downturn, and people rehired more slowly than they had after other downturns. And that's what made the Great Depression great, and that is why we remember it. We had depressions where we had awful data points, such as now, before, but they were so brief we don't remember them. James Grant has written a whole book called The Forgotten Depression about the downturn of the early 20s, which was quite severe, and which is what it was the context in which F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby. The early 20s, not the end of the 20s, but that depression went away and unemployment diminished rapidly because we didn't mess with labor policy. There are other factors, including monetary, of course, but that was key. So in the 30s, for the first time nationally, we put upward pressure on wages, and that sustained unemployment. You have a sort of related phenomenon in the UK with the dole of the 1920s, where it turned out the dole discouraged people from wanting to go back to work, and monetary has a role there. But anyway, this was perceived by everyone, which is why the word dole became a pejorative. And even Franklin Roosevelt didn't use, he said, we don't want the old dole. Everyone kind of knew that you didn't want to pay too much unemployment such that people didn't want to return to work. I'm oversimplifying, but that's the basic reality of what happened. You always want to be sure that people want to work again. And you want people to be able to pay well enough that people want to work, but not so well that they can't afford to hire enough people. That's very much common sense.
A more relaxed, twofold question to end on. Firstly, what are some of your favorite books, and what books have had the greatest influence on your worldview?
Cicero. A cheap way to do that is to read Robert Harris's biography of Cicero in 3 volumes. It's really pretty good. It's not, classicists will find much to criticize in it. All right, it's really pretty good. I like very much Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, because to undertake heavy projects, you need inspiration. And I've always found that book useful. I like, in terms of, I'm quite interested in the analysis of the cost of bureaucracy. And there's a rare book that's kind of a cult book that I recommend called Government Project by Edward C. Banfield, which was a sociologist fieldwork study of a kind of animal farm, an experimental collective farm. So it's a kibbutz/animal farm in the United States that was a product of the New Deal in Casa Grande, Arizona. And what happened on the animal farm, Banfield's Government Project, was that the workers didn't want to share the tractor. They wanted their own tractor. They didn't want a collective chicken coop. They wanted their own chicken coop. The American farmer is very individual sometimes. And if farmers get together and create a collective, what we used to call the grange in the United States, that is, make their own business, that's one thing. But if it's imposed from above by a Washington government, they tend to bridle, to resist. And this book, Government Project, details the bridling of farmers at a heavy-handed authority, and it's hilarious and very reads true, I'll just say. Banfield was not a conservative when he wrote it. He was more like Orwell, sort of observer, but he became convinced over time. So that's interesting. Trying to think what else one could recommend that would be different.
Perhaps I should ask the next question that may spark something, namely, in this time of interminable quarantine, what should we be reading, but also perhaps even watching or listening to make things easier on ourselves?
Well, I really do like the Greeks and Romans because they took the long view. It's not a happy story, though. So about the dangers of populism. I really like to learn about art. Art is a part of philosophy, and usually we don't have time for that, but certainly you can see the role of architecture and art in a republic or democracy. That's very helpful to me. I think a town, if you look at the architecture of what's going on around you, that tells you a lot about what's going to happen politically. My father used to be able to smell subsidy in architecture, and I'm trying to develop that olfactory skill. You almost can when you see a building, you can see if it's subsidized. I like very much, in terms of series, I really like Deutschland 83, a German series that's been around a while. But if you have time to watch it, it's about Germany in 1983 and NATO. And it's very true. I actually lived in Germany in 1983, and it captures what NATO was like and what divided Germany was like, and also the dangers of the Cold War. There's a picture of Brussels that's absolutely perfect. I've never seen Brussels in that period captured so well. I like Occupied, the counterfactual about Norway. I think it's Norway, right? Norway. And when Occupied came out, it seemed improbable to me, particularly the callous behavior of the US ambassador. Now it seems realistic. So I recommend that. I like very much all German television, and I wish more of it were translated or subtitled. The German police shows are awesome. They used to be saccharine, now they're awesome. And in particular, there's one about nursing homes as death cribs, which are totally relevant to this week, when we're discovering in the US how many people are dying in nursing homes and what's wrong with nursing homes. With Matthias Brandt as the star, he's the son of the German politician Willy Brandt. It's called Night Service in German, but that's a little obscure to recommend things in German. I don't care for the royalty shows very much, even though they're getting better and better. So that's television. I also like to read things in English by the family of Thomas Mann, the German writer, because they were a family that went through change, became refugees basically, and captured it all. I very much like Mephisto, the movie by Istvan Szabo about a German actor who stayed in Nazi German and made a deal with the devil, as in Faust by Goethe. And played the role of the devil. That seemed germane to me. It's so wonderful that television is great. I like to look at what games kids are playing and be sure they're playing games that give them some reality. So I like interactive games too. I used to love SimCity for kids. But of course you should read Coolidge's autobiography too, which is wonderful.
Of course, all of your books, of course, our listeners should
No, not my book, his autobiography. I'm just writing the intro.
Oh, my mistake.
I'm writing the intro. Coolidge's autobiography is a real treasure. And the writer, Bruce Fairman, recently praised it. I don't know what political party Mr. Fairman is, but I'm glad to see someone who's not coming at it politically, at Coolidge, politically praise Coolidge. Right now, Coolidge isn't popular in the United States, even among those in his party, the Republican Party, because he wasn't active. Republicans like Theodore Roosevelt because he was get action. I hope Republicans and Democrats find something to like in Coolidge. So I love his autobiography. Also, it's short.
As you would expect, I suppose.
As you would expect.
Well, thank you, Ms. Shlaes, very much. This has been a true privilege.
No, well, thank you. I have quite a number of UK readers. You're in the UK, or are you from the UK?
In the UK, regrettably, yes, although I would much prefer to be an American.
I don't know. Well, in the UK, I worked for the FT for 5 years, and I had wonderful readers there. I really like them. In the past, I wrote for The Spectator. My first book was published first in the UK, then in the US, my Germany book. I love UK readers. They know different things, and often they know more than I know. And they improve the discourse in the United States. They do. So it's the UK intervenes in the elections now, so to speak, because the US election matters to citizens of the UK, and UK follows every county in swing states like Ohio for sure. But UK also elevates the discourse, and that's the more interesting part. We learn from you, and not just through royalty and Downton Abbey, in many, many ways. So that can't be discounted.
I'm sure that all of those listening on this side of the Atlantic will certainly appreciate that. And I'm sure you will have spurred many of them to purchase all of your books just based on those remarks.
Oh, no, well, I'm serious about it. I mean, I think Americans, the UK has pathologies, but at least they're different to the pathologies of the United States. Slightly. So you need a break from your domestic pathologies, and that's why it's good to travel, mentally at least.
That's quite a suitable note to end on, I think. Thank you very much again.